The champagne glass slipped from Cashin Drexler's hand, shattering against the marble floor as he stared at the young woman walking down the aisle. Not the bride. The bridesmaid. Her laugh, her walk, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It was like watching a ghost of his own younger self wrapped in emerald silk. 23 years. That's how long it had been since he'd seen that exact smile, those same dark eyes, that stubborn tilt of the chin. But this wasn't Maribel Rowan, the woman who'd vanished from his life without a trace. This was someone else entirely. Someone who looked exactly like him. The wedding guests turned to stare at the billionaire who'd just dropped his drink, but Cashin couldn't move. His heart hammered against his ribs as the terrible, impossible truth began to dawn. The bride, the woman he was about to marry, was Eve Laura Rowan, Maribel's mother. And this beautiful young woman floating toward him in that bridesmaid dress? She had to be Maribel's daughter. His daughter. How do you explain to someone that you've just discovered your secret child at your own wedding? How do you process that the woman you're marrying is the grandmother of a girl you never knew existed? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Cashin Drexler hadn't always been the man who owned half the city's skyline. 30 years ago, he'd been nobody, a kid from the wrong side of town with calloused hands and big dreams. Back then, his biggest luxury was taking Maribel to the diner on Friday nights, sharing one milkshake between them because that's all his paycheck could stretch. They'd been everything to each other. Young love burns brightest, they say, and theirs had been a wildfire. Late nights talking about the future, stolen kisses behind the old factory, promises whispered under star-filled skies. Maribel believed in him when nobody else would. She saw the empire he could build when all anyone else saw was a dreamer with dirt under his nails. But dreams cost money, and money meant choices. The night he told her about the business opportunity in another state, the chance that could change everything, he'd expected her to pack her bags and follow him anywhere. Instead, she'd gone quiet in that way that meant her heart was breaking. "Don't go," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We can build something here, together. We don't need their money or their opportunities." He'd been 22 and stupid with ambition. "This is our shot, Maribel. Our only shot. If I don't take this chance now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what if." The fight that followed had been brutal. Words that cut deep, accusations that couldn't be taken back. She'd called him selfish. He'd called her afraid. By morning, he was gone, and by the time he'd made his first million 2 years later, she'd disappeared completely. He'd hired investigators. Searched social media that didn't exist back then. Called every mutual friend they'd ever had. Maribel Rowan had vanished like smoke, and eventually, he'd forced himself to stop looking. He'd buried that heartbreak under layers of success, expensive suits, and relationships that never quite filled the hole she'd left behind. Now, 30 years later, he stood in a cathedral wearing a tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, about to marry the mother of the woman who'd owned his heart. And staring at a young woman who had his eyes, his stubborn jaw, his restless energy. The bridesmaid, Celine, he remembered Eve Laura mentioning her granddaughter's name, caught him staring and smiled. That smile nearly dropped him to his knees. It was his smile, the one his mother had always said could charm the birds from the trees. The organ music swelled, and Eve Laura appeared at the back of the church, radiant in cream silk and pearls. At 68, she was still stunning, with silver hair that caught the light and the kind of grace that comes from weathering life's storms with dignity intact. Their courtship had been gentle, comfortable. Two people who'd found companionship in their golden years after love had disappointed them both. Or so he'd thought. As she walked toward him, her eyes shining with happiness, Cashin felt the world tilt sideways. How long had she known? Had this all been some elaborate setup, or was fate playing the cruelest joke imaginable? The ceremony began, but Cashin barely heard the words. His gaze kept drifting to Celine, cataloging every familiar gesture, every expression that mirrored his own. When she dabbed at her grandmother's tears with a tissue, he saw himself at her age, always ready to fix things, to take care of the people he loved. The rings were exchanged. Vows were spoken. And through it all, Cashin felt like an actor in someone else's play, going through motions while his entire world rearranged itself around him. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced. As Cashin leaned in to kiss his new wife, his eyes locked with Celine's over Evalora's shoulder. For just a moment, something flickered in her gaze, a question, maybe, or recognition of something she couldn't quite name. The reception was a blur of congratulations and champagne toasts. Cashin moved through it all like a sleepwalker, shaking hands and accepting good wishes while his mind raced. He watched Celine laugh with her friends, dance with her boyfriend, help her grandmother with her dress. Every moment revealed another piece of himself reflected back at him. When she approached him during the father-daughter dance, a dance he should have had with her years ago, Cashin's throat nearly closed. "Mr. Drexler," she said, her voice warm and slightly nervous. "I wanted to thank you for making my grandmother so happy. I've never seen her smile the way she does with you." Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. She had Maribel's delicate features softened around his stronger jawline, his dark eyes sparked with Maribel's intelligence. "Please, call me Cashin," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "And you're Celine, right? Your grandmother talks about you constantly." She laughed, and the sound hit him like a physical blow. It was Maribel's laugh, bright and infectious, but with an undertone that was purely his own. "All good things, I hope," she said. "Though knowing Grandma Eve-Laura, she probably told you about the time I tried to build a rocket in her garage when I was 12. A rocket? At 12. Cashin had spent that entire summer when he was 12 building model airplanes, dreaming of flight, of escape, of reaching for something beyond the small town that felt like a cage. "She did mention you were quite the inventor," he said carefully. "What are you studying now?" "Architecture," Celine said, her eyes lighting up. "I want to design buildings that change skylines, you know? Create something that lasts, something that matters." The words hit him like a sledgehammer. Those had been his exact dreams at her age, the same hunger to build something permanent in a world that felt temporary. That's wonderful," he said, and meant it, even as his heart shattered a little more with each passing second. The evening wore on, but Cashin felt like he was watching everything through glass. This should have been one of the happiest nights of his life. Instead, he felt like he was drowning in 23 years of missed birthdays, graduation ceremonies, good-night stories, and bedtime hugs. As the last guests filtered out and Eve-Laura went to change out of her wedding dress, Cashin found himself alone in the garden with Celine. She was sitting on a stone bench, her bridesmaid dress pooled around her like water, staring up at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. She glanced at him, and in the moonlight, the resemblance was almost supernatural. "I was just thinking about my grandfather," she said softly. "He died when I was little, but Grandma Eve-Laura says he used to tell her that every star was a wish waiting to come true." "Sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." She paused, then looked at him directly. "Can I ask you something? And please don't think I'm crazy for asking." Cashin's heart stopped. "Of course. Do you ever feel like you've met someone before, even when you know you haven't?" She shook her head, smiling ruefully. "Sorry, that probably sounds ridiculous." It's just, when I look at you, I get this weird feeling like I should know you somehow." Before Cashin could answer, Eve Laura appeared in the doorway, now dressed in traveling clothes for their honeymoon flight. "There you are," she called, but something in her voice made them both turn. She stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale as she took in the sight of Cashin and Celine sitting together in the moonlight. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Eva Laura's hand flew to her throat, and Cashin saw the exact moment she realized he knew. The secret was out, hanging in the air between them like a live wire, and there was no going back now. What happens when the bride realizes her new husband has just discovered the truth she's been hiding for over 2 decades? Will this family survive the revelation that threatens to destroy them all before their new beginning even has a chance to start? 23 years earlier, Maribel Rowan pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall, staring at the pink lines that would change everything. 2 lines. Positive. Pregnant with Cashin Drexler's baby, and he was already 3 states away chasing his dreams. The morning sickness had started 2 weeks after he'd left. At first, she'd blamed it on heartbreak, the kind of grief that makes your stomach turn and your world spin sideways. But when her period never came, when the exhaustion hit like a freight train, she knew. She'd driven to 3 different pharmacies to buy pregnancy tests, too scared someone might see her, might talk. Small towns had big mouths, and the last thing she needed was her business spread across every coffee shop and church pew before she figured out what to do. Her mother, Eve Laura, found her crying on the bathroom floor an hour later, the test still clutched in her shaking hands. "Oh, sweetheart," Eve Laura whispered, kneeling beside her daughter. "How far along?" 6 weeks, maybe 7, Maribel sobbed. "Mama, what am I going to do? He's gone. He made his choice, and it wasn't me." Eve Laura pulled her daughter into her arms, rocking her like she had when Maribel was small and the world seemed too big to handle. "We'll figure this out together, baby girl. You don't have to face this alone." The next few months blurred together like watercolors in rain. Morning sickness that lasted all day. Doctor appointments paid for with money Eve Laura scraped together from her seamstress work. Nights spent crying into her pillow, wondering if she should call Cashin, tell him about the baby growing inside her. Pride stopped her every time. He'd made it clear that his future lay somewhere else, with someone else, doing something bigger than anything their little town could offer. What would he say if she called? That she was trying to trap him? That this was just another chain holding him back from his dreams? So she stayed silent, working double shifts at the diner until her belly got too big to hide, then switching to Eva Laura's sewing business, taking in alterations and wedding dresses from her mother's bedroom when walking became difficult. The whole town whispered, of course. Poor Maribel Rowan, abandoned by that Drexler boy, left to raise his bastard child alone. She held her head high anyway, because that's what Rowan women did. They survived. They endured. They raised their children with love and dignity, no matter what anyone said. Celine came into the world on a snowy February morning, screaming her lungs out and fighting from her first breath. She had Cashin's dark hair and his stubborn chin, but Maribel's delicate features softened the sharp edges. Perfect tiny fingers that wrapped around Maribel's thumb like they'd never let go. "She's beautiful," Eve Laura whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held her granddaughter. "Look at those eyes. She's going to be a force of nature, just like her daddy." Maribel had flinched at the mention of Cashin, but she couldn't deny the truth. Even as a newborn, Celine had an intensity about her, a restlessness that seemed to demand more from the world. The years that followed were hard but good. Maribel worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on Celine's back. Eve Laura helped however she could, babysitting during the day so Maribel could work, teaching Celine to sew when her little fingers were finally steady enough to hold a needle. They created their own little family unit, The Three Rowan Women Against the World. Celine grew up smart and curious, always asking questions, always building something or taking something apart to see how it worked. By the time she was 5, she was designing elaborate blanket forts with structural integrity that impressed the adults. By 10, she was sketching buildings that looked like they belonged in magazines. "She gets that from him," Maribel would whisper to her mother late at night, watching Celine work on her latest project. "The way she sees things, the way she wants to build everything bigger and better. That's all Cashin." "Maybe," Eve Laura would say. "But the kindness, the way she takes care of everyone around her? That's pure you, baby girl." The questions about her father started when Celine turned 12. Innocent at first. Where was he? Why wasn't he around? Did he know about her? Maribel deflected with half-truths and subject changes, but Celine was too smart to be fooled for long. "Is he dead?" Celine asked one night, her voice small and uncertain. "No, sweetheart. He's not dead." "Does he know about me?" Maribel's heart broke a little more. "It's complicated, baby. Adult stuff that doesn't make much sense even to adults." "But he's out there somewhere." "Yes, he's out there somewhere." That seemed to satisfy Celine for a while, but Maribel knew the questions would come back. They always did. And each time, it got harder to explain why the man who'd helped create this amazing human being had never once tried to find them. The truth was, Maribel had followed Cashin's career from a distance. Hard not to, when his name started appearing in business magazines and newspaper articles. Drexler Development had grown from a small construction company into a real estate empire. His face had been on the cover of Forbes twice, and there were rumors he was worth over $1 billion now. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, Maribel would look him up online. He'd never married, though there had been a string of beautiful, sophisticated women photographed on his arm at charity events and business dinners. Women who looked nothing like a small-town seamstress who'd never made it past community college. He looked good. Older, obviously, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and long hours. But still handsome, still carrying himself with that confidence that had first attracted her all those years ago. Still the man who'd owned her heart completely before he'd shattered it beyond repair. What would he think if he could see Celine now? Would he be proud of the young woman she'd become, or would he see her as just another responsibility he'd never wanted? Maribel had spent 23 years protecting her daughter from that rejection. She'd rather carry the secret to her grave than watch Celine's heart break the way hers had. But secrets have a way of coming out, don't they? And sometimes they choose the worst possible moment to surface. Like when your mother falls in love with your daughter's father and doesn't realize the connection until it's too late to stop the wedding. "Grandma Eve Laura, you're glowing," Celine laughed, watching her grandmother flutter around the kitchen like a teenager getting ready for prom. "I haven't seen you this happy since, well, ever." Eve Laura paused in her frantic search for the perfect tablecloth, her cheeks pink with embarrassment and joy. "Oh, stop it. I'm 68 years old, for heaven's sake. I don't glow." "You absolutely do," Celine insisted, wrapping her arms around her grandmother from behind. "And I love seeing you like this. Cashin makes you happy, doesn't he?" The name hit Eve Laura like a physical blow, though she hid it well. 3 months of dating Cashin Drexler, and she still felt like she was living in a beautiful dream that might shatter at any moment. He was kind, successful, and genuinely interested in the quiet life she'd built in their small town. After 40 years of widowhood, she'd never expected to find love again. What she definitely hadn't expected was for that love to have the same name as her daughter's long-lost first love. "He does make me happy," Eve Laura admitted, turning to face her granddaughter. "But are you sure you're okay with this? I know it's fast, and I know it changes things. Grandma, you deserve this, Celine said firmly. You've spent your whole life taking care of me and Mom. It's time someone took care of you for a change. If only it were that simple. Eve Laura had tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence. Cashin was a common enough name, and Drexler wasn't exactly unique. But the night he'd told her about his past, about the great love he'd lost in his youth, about a girl named Maribel who'd broken his heart by refusing to follow his dreams, she'd known. This was him. The father Celine had never met. The man who'd unknowingly broken 2 generations of Rowan women's hearts. She should have ended it then, should have made up some excuse and walked away. But Cashin was gentle with her in ways her late husband had never been. He listened when she talked, remembered small details about her day, brought her flowers for no reason except that he'd seen them and thought of her. For the first time in decades, Eve Laura felt like a woman instead of just a mother and grandmother. Was it so wrong to want that feeling to last a little longer? I found something in the attic yesterday, Celine said, pulling a shoebox from under the counter. I was looking for Christmas decorations, and this was tucked way back in the corner. Eva Laura's blood turned to ice. She recognized that box, the one Maribel had hidden years ago, filled with photos and mementos from her relationship with Cashin. The one they'd both agreed should stay buried forever. Celine, honey, maybe you shouldn't. But Celine had already opened it. Her eyes went wide as she pulled out photograph after photograph of her mother with a young man who looked exactly like her. Same dark eyes, same stubborn jawline, same restless energy that seemed to radiate from every picture. Who is this? Celine whispered, her voice barely audible. Grandma, who is this man with Mom? Eve Laura sank into a chair, feeling every one of her 68 years settle into her bones. 23 years of carefully guarded secrets, and it all came tumbling down because of Christmas decorations. That's... She swallowed hard, trying to find words that wouldn't destroy everything. That's your father, sweetheart. Celine dropped the photos like they were on fire. My father? But Mom said he was gone, that it was complicated. She never said, she never told me what he looked like. She was protecting you. From what? Celine's voice rose, pain and confusion bleeding through every word. From knowing that my father looks exactly like me? From understanding why I've always felt like I was missing some essential piece of myself. Eve Laura reached for her granddaughter's hands, but Celine pulled away, staring at the scattered photographs like they held answers to questions she'd been asking her whole life. His name was Cashin, Eve Laura said quietly. Cashin Drexler. The color drained from Celine's face. Drexler? Like your Cashin. Oh, honey. Eva Laura's heart shattered as understanding dawned in Celine's eyes. I didn't know. When I met him, when we started seeing each other, I never connected. He looks so different now, and it's been so many years. You're dating my father, Celine said flatly. You're marrying my father, and he doesn't even know I exist. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Celine exploded, jumping to her feet. For 23 years, I've wondered about him. I've made up stories about why he wasn't here, about what kind of man he was, about whether he'd be proud of me. And this whole time, he's been 3 towns over building his empire, completely unaware that he has a daughter. Tears streamed down Eva Laura's cheeks. Your mother thought it was best. Best for who? Celine demanded. Best for him, so he could go on living his life without any inconvenient responsibilities? Best for her, so she didn't have to face his rejection? Or best for me, so I could spend my entire childhood feeling like half of me was missing? She was protecting you from getting hurt. By making sure I stayed hurt instead? Celine laughed bitterly. Do you know what it's like growing up without a father? Do you know what it's like when other kids ask about him and you have nothing to say because your own mother won't tell you the truth? Eve Laura wanted to defend Maribel, to explain the fear and pride that had kept her daughter silent all these years. But how do you explain that kind of pain to someone who's just discovered their entire life has been built on lies? Does Mom know? Celine asked suddenly. Does she know you're dating him? She knows his name. I don't think she's made the connection yet. Celine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But she will, won't she? When she meets him at the wedding, when she sees that he's the same Cashin who broke her heart 23 years ago. Celine, please, you can't tell her. Not yet. Let me figure out how to handle this. Handle it? Celine stared at her grandmother like she'd grown a second head. Grandma, you're marrying my father in 6 weeks. My mother is planning to be your maid of honor. I'm supposed to be your bridesmaid. And you want to handle this? The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Eve Laura watched her granddaughter process the magnitude of what they were facing, saw the exact moment when the full implications hit her. He's going to find out, Celine said quietly. At the wedding, when he sees me, when he meets Mom, he's going to figure it out. Maybe not. It's been so long, and you were just a baby. Look at these pictures, Grandma. Celine picked up a photograph of young Cashin laughing at something off camera. Look at my face. I'm his clone. There's no way he won't recognize himself in me. She was right, of course. The resemblance was undeniable. Even a stranger would notice the similarities, let alone the man who'd contributed half her DNA. What are we going to do? Eve Laura whispered. Celine stared down at the photograph in her hands. Her father at 22, his arm around her mother, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness that only comes with first love. For a moment, her expression softened, and Eve Laura saw the little girl who used to ask endless questions about the father she'd never known. Then Celine's jaw set in a way that was pure Cashin Drexler, and Eve Laura knew they were all in for the fight of their lives. We're going to find out what kind of man he really is, Celine said, her voice steady and determined. And then we're going to decide whether he deserves to know the truth. But would the truth destroy them all before they had a chance to find out if this broken family could somehow be made whole? Cashin Drexler stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the city skyline stretch endlessly toward the horizon. 30 floors below, traffic moved like blood through arteries, everyone rushing toward something they thought would make them happy. Money, success, recognition. The same things that had driven him out of that small town 23 years ago. The same things that had cost him everything that truly mattered. His phone buzzed with another congratulatory message about the wedding. Word traveled fast in business circles, and everyone wanted to know about the mystery woman who'd finally captured the heart of one of the country's most eligible bachelors. If they only knew he'd been caught instead of doing the catching. Eve Laura Rowan had walked into his life like sunlight breaking through clouds. He'd been in her town for a charity project, building a new community center for underprivileged kids, when she'd approached him after the groundbreaking ceremony. Mr. Drexler, she'd said, her voice warm but not flirtatious, I wanted to thank you for what you're doing here. This town hasn't seen this kind of investment in decades. She'd been wearing a simple blue dress and pearl earrings, her silver hair caught back in an elegant twist. Nothing flashy or attention-seeking, just a woman comfortable in her own skin. After years of dating women who saw him as a prize to be won or a bank account to be accessed, her genuine gratitude had hit him like a revelation. It's my pleasure, Mrs. Rowan. Sometimes success means giving back to the places that shaped you. You're from a small town originally? Born and raised about 3 hours from here. Left when I was 22 and never looked back. The words had tasted bitter in his mouth, but they were true. What about you? Lived here your whole life? Most of it. I was born here, moved away when I got married, came back when my husband died. My daughter and granddaughter are here, so this is home. They'd talked for an hour on that first day, standing in the construction site dust, finding an easy rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She'd told him about her late husband, her work with the local historical society, her pride in her granddaughter who was studying architecture. He'd found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years, about growing up poor, about the hunger that had driven him to succeed, about the loneliness that success couldn't cure. When he'd asked her to dinner that night, she'd blushed like a teenager. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, Mr. Drexler. I'm 68 years old, and you're 53 and tired of eating alone," he'd finished. "What do you say we make each other a little less lonely?" That first dinner had turned into dozens more. Long walks through her neighborhood, where she knew everyone's name and everyone's story. Quiet evenings on her front porch, talking about books and dreams and the weight of years lived. She'd introduced him to a kind of contentment he'd never experienced. Not the adrenaline rush of closing a big deal or the temporary high of acquiring a new property, but the deep satisfaction of being truly known by another person. For the first time in his adult life, Cashin had found himself slowing down. He started taking weekends off, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. He delegated more to his managers and spent less time in the office, choosing instead to drive the 3 hours to Evalora's town, to her quiet street, to the home she'd built with love and patience. Her daughter, Maribel, had been polite but distant when they'd finally met. A beautiful woman in her mid-40s with guarded eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. She'd answered his questions with single sentences and excused herself early, leaving him with the distinct impression that she disapproved of her mother's new relationship. "Don't take it personally," Evlora had said later, walking him to his car. "Maribel's been hurt before. She doesn't trust easily, especially when it comes to men and their promises. Bad divorce. She was never married. Had her heart broken when she was young and never really recovered. She's devoted her whole life to raising Celine, and I think she's afraid of anything that might disrupt the life we've built together." Cashin had understood that kind of protectiveness. He'd felt it himself once, for a girl with dark hair and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. A girl who'd believed in his dreams when no one else would, who'd seen the man he could become when all he could see were the obstacles in his way. Maribel. The name had haunted him for decades, whispered in his memory like a prayer or a curse. He'd tried to find her after he'd made his first million, had hired investigators and searched every database he could access. But she'd vanished completely, leaving no trace except the hole in his chest where his heart used to be. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd found love again with a woman whose daughter shared his lost love's name. A sign from the universe, maybe, or just proof that God had a twisted sense of humor. "I want you to meet Celine properly before the wedding," Evlora had said just last week. "She's the most important person in my world, and I need to know you two will get along." He'd agreed, of course. Celine seemed like a remarkable young woman from what little he'd observed. Intelligent, ambitious, kind to her grandmother in a way that spoke well of her character. But there was something about her that nagged at him, some quality he couldn't quite identify that felt familiar. The way she laughed, maybe. Or the stubborn set of her jaw when she was thinking hard about something. The restless energy that seemed to radiate from her whenever she talked about her architectural projects. She reminded him of himself at that age, back when the world had seemed full of infinite possibilities and he'd been stupid enough to think love would wait for him to be ready for it. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his brooding. "Mr. Drexler? Your 3 o'clock is here. Send them in." But instead of his expected business meeting, Cashin turned to find a young woman standing in his doorway. Not just any young woman. Celine Rowan, wearing jeans and a blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face set in an expression of determination that made his chest tighten with recognition. "Celine? What are you doing here? Is everything okay? Is your grandmother?" "She's fine," Celine said, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. "I came to talk to you about." She walked to his window, looking out at the skyline with the same hunger he'd once felt, the same need to conquer and build and leave a mark on the world. When she turned back to him, her eyes were blazing with an intensity that stopped his heart. "About why you left my mother 23 years ago," she said quietly. "And about why you never came back." The world tilted sideways. Cashin gripped the edge of his desk, staring at this young woman who looked exactly like him, who carried herself exactly like him, who was asking about Maribel Rowan with the voice of someone who had every right to demand answers. "Your mother," he whispered. "Maribel Rowan," Celine said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "Dark hair, brown eyes, used to work at Mike's Diner on Main Street. Ring any bells?" Cashin couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this impossible young woman who had his eyes, his jawline, his restless energy, and Maribel's name on her lips. "You're her daughter," he said stupidly. "I'm your daughter," Celine replied, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "And you're marrying my grandmother in 3 weeks without knowing that your first love has been raising your child for 23 years. The room spun around him. All those years of searching for Maribel, of wondering what had become of her, and she'd been here all along. Not just here, but raising his daughter. His daughter, who looked exactly like him and had grown up without ever knowing his name. "She never told me," he whispered, sinking into his chair. "All these years, and she never told me." "Would you have wanted to know?" Celine asked, and there was a challenge in her voice that cut straight through his shock. "Would you have given up your empire to raise a baby with a small-town girl who wasn't sophisticated enough for your new life?" "That's not. I never." He looked up at her, this fierce young woman who was his daughter, and saw himself reflected back in ways that went far beyond physical resemblance. "I loved your mother. I loved her more than anything in the world. But not enough to stay. I thought she'd come with me. I thought we'd build something together. Instead, she built something without you." Celine's voice softened slightly. "She built me." And suddenly Cashin understood that the conversation he was about to have would change everything. His relationship with Eve Laura, his understanding of his own past, and his entire future. But first, he had to ask the question that was tearing him apart. "Does your mother know I'm marrying your grandmother?" The wedding dress shop fell silent except for the soft rustle of silk and the tick of an antique clock. Maribel Rowan stood in front of the 3-way mirror, pinning the hem of her mother's wedding gown, trying to pretend her hands weren't shaking. "You've been quiet all morning," Eve Laura said, watching her daughter in the mirror. "Everything okay?" Maribel forced a smile, her mouth full of pins. "Just concentrating. This beadwork is delicate, and I don't want to catch it with the needle." It was a lie, of course. She'd been altering wedding gowns for 20 years and could do this particular hemming job in her sleep. What was making her hands shake had nothing to do with delicate beadwork, and everything to do with the name that had been haunting her for weeks. Cashin Drexler. When her mother had first mentioned her new boyfriend's name, Maribel's heart had stopped for exactly 3 beats before rationality kicked in. Cashin wasn't exactly an uncommon name, and Drexler could belong to anyone. There had to be dozens, maybe hundreds of men with that name in the tri-state area. But then she'd seen the engagement announcement in the local paper. Cashin Drexler, 53, founder and CEO of Drexler Development, originally from Cedar Falls. Cedar Falls, the town where she'd grown up, where she'd fallen in love, where she'd had her heart broken so thoroughly she'd spent the next 23 years avoiding any mention of the man who'd destroyed her. It had to be him. It had to be. The man who'd promised to love her forever before walking away without a backward glance was now engaged to her mother. The father of her child, who'd never known he had a child, was about to become her stepfather. If there was a God, he definitely had a sadistic sense of humor. Maribel. Evalora's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Honey, are you sure you're all right? You look pale. I'm fine, Mama. Just tired. Maribel removed the pins from her mouth and sat back on her heels, studying the hemline. There. That should do it. Evlora turned slowly, admiring the way the ivory silk caught the light. At 68, she was still beautiful, with the kind of grace that came from a life well lived. She deserved happiness. She deserved love. She deserved to marry whoever she wanted without her daughter's past complications destroying everything. But how do you tell your mother that her fiancé is the man who broke your heart 23 years ago? How do you explain that he's the father of the granddaughter she adores, and that you've spent over 2 decades making sure he never found out? I wish you'd meet him properly before the wedding, Evlora said, stepping down from the platform. I know you were polite when he stopped by the house, but you barely said 2 words to him. I was being respectful. You deserve your privacy. Maribel. Evalora's voice carried the tone she'd used when Maribel was 16 and trying to sneak out past curfew. What's really going on here? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've known you for 46 years. You get that same look on your face when you're scared that you used to get when you were little and thought you were in trouble. Maribel's throat closed. Mama, The shop door chimed, and both women turned to see Celine walking in with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that made Maribel's blood run cold. Her daughter's face was flushed, her eyes bright with the kind of intensity that meant she'd discovered something important and was trying to decide what to do about it. I brought caffeine, Celine announced, but her voice sounded strained. Figured you might need it for all this wedding prep. Thank you, sweetheart. Evlora accepted her coffee with a smile. Perfect timing. I was just trying to convince your mother to spend more time with Cashin before the wedding. She's been avoiding him like he has the plague. Celine's gaze snapped to her mother, and in that moment, Maribel knew. Somehow, her brilliant daughter had figured it out. The careful secret she'd guarded for 23 years was written all over Celine's face. Maybe Mom has her reasons, Celine said carefully. What kind of reasons? Evlora looked back and forth between her daughter and granddaughter, confusion evident in her voice. Girls, what's going on here? Maribel's chest felt like it was caving in. 23 years of protection, of careful silence, of building a life that kept them all safe from the truth. And now it was crumbling around her like a house built on sand. Celine, she whispered, and her voice cracked on her daughter's name. I found the box, Mom. Celine's words fell into the shop like stones into still water. The one in the attic with all the pictures. Evlora frowned. What box? The one with photos of Mom and her old boyfriend. The one she's been hiding for 23 years. Celine's voice was steady, but Maribel could hear the pain underneath. The one with pictures of my father. The coffee cup slipped from Evalora's hand, shattering against the hardwood floor in a splash of brown liquid and white ceramic. Her face went completely white as understanding dawned. "No," she breathed. "No, that's not possible." "His name is Cassian Drexler," Celine continued, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. "Same as your fiancé. Same as the man you're marrying in 3 weeks. Same as my father, who never knew I existed because Mom was too proud to tell him she was pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Maribel watched her mother process the revelation, saw the exact moment when all the pieces clicked into place. The shock, the horror, the realization that she'd fallen in love with her daughter's first heartbreak. "Oh my God," Eve Laura whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "Oh my God, what have I done?" "You fell in love," Maribel said quietly, finding her voice at last. "You didn't know. How could you have known? But I should have seen it. I should have recognized him, should have made the connection." "He looks different now," Celine interjected. "Older, more polished. Gray in his hair, expensive clothes, everything that comes with success. Mom probably wouldn't have recognized him either if she'd met him first." Eve Laura looked up at her daughter with tears in her eyes. "All these years, you've been carrying this alone. Raising his child, working 3 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, and he never knew. He's been living his life completely unaware that he has a daughter." "I made that choice," Maribel said firmly. "He made it clear that his future was elsewhere, with bigger things than our small town could offer. I wasn't going to trap him with an unplanned pregnancy." "But you trapped yourself instead." Eva Laura's voice was full of pain. "You sacrificed everything, college, career, love, marriage, to protect a man who didn't even know he needed protection." "I protected Celine," Maribel corrected. "I protected her from growing up feeling unwanted, from being seen as a mistake or an obligation. I gave her a family that chose her completely." "And what about what she deserved?" Celine asked, her composure finally cracking. "What about my right to know my father? What about his right to know he had a daughter?" The question hung in the air between them. 23 years of complicated emotions and impossible choices condensed into a single moment of reckoning. "I was 23 years old," Maribel said, her voice breaking. "I was scared and heartbroken and alone. I made the best decision I could with what I knew then." "And now?" Celine pressed. "What decision are you going to make now?" Maribel looked at her daughter, this brilliant, fierce young woman who deserved so much more than the secrets and silence that had shaped her life. Then she looked at her mother, who was staring at her wedding dress like it had turned into a snake. "Now we figure out how to tell the truth without destroying everyone we love in the process." But as the 3 Rowan women stood surrounded by silk and shattered ceramic, the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway told them their time for careful planning had just run out. Because sometimes the truth doesn't wait for you to be ready. Sometimes it walks through the door wearing an expensive suit and carrying flowers for the woman you've just realized you can't marry. And sometimes it looks exactly like the daughter you never knew you had. The flowers scattered across the floor like broken dreams as Cassian Drexler stood frozen in the doorway of the bridal shop. White roses and baby's breath, crushed under his Italian leather shoes as he stared at the woman who'd haunted his dreams for 23 years. Maribel Rowan looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. Same dark hair, though shorter now and touched with silver at the temples. Same brown eyes that had once looked at him like he held all the answers in the universe. But there were lines around those eyes now, evidence of years he hadn't been there to share, struggles he'd never helped her face. "Hello, Cassian," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same soft strength that had first made him fall in love with her at 19. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe as 23 years of questions and regrets crashed over him like a tidal wave. Behind Maribel stood Celine, their daughter, though he was still struggling to wrap his mind around that truth, and Eve Laura, the woman he'd planned to marry, whose face was streaked with tears. "I brought flowers," he said stupidly, looking down at the ruined bouquet at his feet. "For you. For Eve Laura. I thought." He trailed off, because what was the point of explaining what he'd thought when everything he'd believed about his life had just been turned upside down? "We need to talk," Maribel said, stepping forward. "All of us." "Do we?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, anger finally breaking through the shock. "Seems like the time for talking was 23 years ago, when you were carrying my child and decided I didn't deserve to know about it." "Cashin," Eve Laura warned, but he barely heard her. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he continued, his voice rising. "Do you have any concept of what you've stolen from me? From her? From all of us?" "I was protecting her," Maribel shot back, her own temper flaring. "I was protecting both of you from a situation that would have ruined everyone's lives." "That wasn't your decision to make." "It was absolutely my decision to make." Maribel stepped closer, and he could see the fire that had first attracted him burning in her eyes. "You made your choice when you walked away. You chose your dreams over us, your future over our relationship. I just chose to let you have what you wanted without any guilt. I asked you to come with me. I begged you to trust me, to believe that we could build something together. In another state, away from everything and everyone I'd ever known, dependent entirely on your success. What happens when you get tired of me, Cashin? What happens when you realize that a small-town girl doesn't fit into your big city plans?" "I would never have gotten tired of you." The words came out raw and honest. "I loved you. I loved you more than I've ever loved anyone before or since." "Past tense," Maribel noted, and there was something broken in her voice. "You loved me then. But you don't even know me now. We're strangers, Cashin. We've been strangers for 23 years. Whose fault is that?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Celine shifted uncomfortably, looking back and forth between her parents like she was watching a tennis match that could destroy her life. "Both of ours," Maribel admitted finally. "I should have told you about the pregnancy. You should have tried harder to find me when you realized what you'd lost." "I did try. I hired investigators, searched every database I could access. You vanished completely. I changed my name back to Rowan after you left. Went back to using my maiden name." She wrapped her arms around herself defensively. "I couldn't stand being reminded of what I'd lost every time someone said my name." Cashin felt like he'd been punched in the gut. She'd loved him enough to change her name, to erase every trace of their relationship except for the child she'd carried alone. "I looked for Maribel Drexler," he said quietly. "I never thought to look for Maribel Rowan." "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I know you did. I followed your career, saw the articles about your success. I knew you were looking, but by then, Celine was born, and I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that you'd take her away from me. Scared that you'd see her as a burden, an obligation that would limit your freedom. Scared that you'd reject her the same way you'd rejected me." "I never rejected you," Cashin said, his heart breaking all over again. "I asked you to marry me. I asked you to build a life with me. On your terms. In your world. With no consideration for what I wanted or needed. What did you want?" He stepped closer, searching her face for answers to questions that had tortured him for decades. "What would have made you stay?" Maribel looked at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wanted you to want our life together more than you wanted your dreams alone. I wanted to matter enough for you to choose me without me having to ask." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He had asked her to choose him, but he'd never offered to choose her in return. He'd expected her to sacrifice everything while he sacrificed nothing. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Maribel, I'm so sorry." "So am I," she replied. "For all of it. For keeping Celine from you, for letting pride and fear make my decisions, for the years we all lost because I was too stubborn to tell the truth." "Where does that leave us now?" Celine asked, speaking for the first time since he'd arrived. "What happens now that all the secrets are out?" Cashin looked at his daughter, God, his daughter, and felt his heart crack open. She was so beautiful, so strong, so much like both of them that it took his breath away. 23 years of birthdays he'd missed, scraped knees he hadn't kissed better, bedtime stories he'd never read. 23 years of being a father without knowing it. "Now we figure out how to be a family," he said, the words feeling strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "If that's what you want." "What about Grandma Eve Laura?" Celine looked at her grandmother, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the entire confrontation. "What about the wedding?" Eve Laura stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the tears streaming down her face. "There isn't going to be a wedding," she said quietly. "I can't marry the father of my granddaughter. I can't marry the man my daughter never stopped loving." "Eve Laura, no," Cashin started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "It's okay," she said with heartbreaking grace. "I've had love in my life. Real love, with my husband. What we had was beautiful, but it was never meant to last. This family needs to heal, and they can't do that with me in the middle of it." She kissed her granddaughter's cheek, then her daughter's, then walked to the door with the quiet dignity that had first attracted Cashin to her. "Eve Laura, wait," he called, but she turned back with a sad smile. "Take care of them," she said simply. "Take care of both of them. They're the most precious things you'll ever have." And then she was gone, leaving Cashin alone with the woman who'd broken his heart and the daughter who was about to put it back together again. But sometimes, when everything falls apart, it creates space for something better to grow in its place. 3 weeks later, Cashin sat in his car outside Maribel's house at 6 in the morning, watching the windows for signs of life. He'd been doing this every day since the confrontation at the bridal shop, not stalking, exactly, but trying to work up the courage to knock on the door and ask if they could start over. The house was small but well-maintained, with flower boxes under every window and a vegetable garden that spoke of someone who put down roots and tended them carefully. So different from his penthouse apartment with its cold marble surfaces and million-dollar view of a city that never slept. The front door opened, and Celine emerged in running clothes, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She stretched on the front porch for a moment, then started down the street in an easy jog that reminded him of his own morning routine. Before he could lose his nerve, Cashin got out of the car. "Mind if I join you?" he called softly, not wanting to wake the neighbors. Celine stopped, turning to look at him with an expression he couldn't read. She was wearing earbuds, but she pulled them out and studied his face in the early morning light. "You run?" she asked. "Every morning." 5 miles, usually. Though I typically stick to the gym treadmill. Real running is better. More unpredictable. She gestured toward the tree-lined street that stretched ahead of them. "You sure you can keep up with a 23-year-old? Try me." They started at an easy pace, their footsteps synchronized on the empty sidewalk. For the first mile, neither of them spoke, just two people running side by side as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Why are you here?" Celine asked finally, her breathing steady despite the pace. "I want to know you," Cashin replied honestly. "I've missed 23 years of your life, and I can't get those back, but maybe I can understand who you've become. And you think a morning jog is going to accomplish that?" "I think it's a start." They turned the corner onto Main Street, passing the diner where Maribel had once worked, the hardware store where he'd bought his first toolbox, the library where they'd studied together when they were dating. Every building held memories, most of them bittersweet. "Tell me about your childhood," he said. "The things I should know but don't." Celine glanced at him sideways. "That's a pretty broad question." "Start anywhere. What's your earliest memory?" "Building a fort out of couch cushions with Mom and Grandma Eve Laura when I was 4. We spent the whole day in there, eating peanut butter sandwiches and reading stories." She smiled at the memory. "I felt so safe in that fort, like nothing bad could ever happen as long as the three of us were together." Cashin's chest tightened. He should have been there, should have been part of that memory, instead of hearing about it 20 years later from a daughter who was essentially a stranger. What else? Learning to ride a bike in the parking lot behind Murphy's grocery store. Mom ran alongside me for hours, holding the seat, promising she wouldn't let go. When she finally did, I rode halfway across the parking lot before I realized she wasn't there anymore. Were you scared? Terrified, but also proud. I'd done it myself, you know? I'd learned to balance on my own. She shot him another glance. Mom said that's what growing up is, learning when to let go and when to hold on. They ran in silence for another block, passing the elementary school where Celine had learned to read, the playground where she'd skinned her knees and made her first friends. "What about you?" she asked. "What was your childhood like?" "Complicated. My dad worked construction when he could find work, which wasn't often. My mom cleaned houses for rich families on the other side of town. We never had much, but they did their best." "Is that why you left? To make sure you'd never be poor again?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything. "Partly. But mostly I left because I was young and stupid and thought I could have everything I wanted if I just worked hard enough." "And could you?" Cashin slowed his pace, thinking about the question. "I got everything I thought I wanted. Money, success, recognition. But I didn't get the things that actually mattered." "Like what?" "Like family. Like love that lasts longer than a business deal. Like someone who knows me well enough to call me on my bullshit." He looked at her seriously. "Like a daughter who challenges me to be better than I am." They'd completed the loop and were back on Celine Street. She slowed to a walk, cooling down as they approached the house where she'd grown up. "I used to fantasize about you," she said quietly. "When I was little, I'd make up stories about who you were and why you weren't there. Sometimes you were a soldier fighting overseas. Sometimes you were a secret agent who had to stay away to protect us. Sometimes you were dead, which was awful but at least meant you hadn't chosen to leave." "Celine. The worst part wasn't not having a father," she continued. "The worst part was not knowing if you would have wanted me if you'd known I existed." Cashin stopped walking entirely, his heart breaking all over again. "I would have wanted you. I would have wanted you more than anything in the world. But you would have resented Mom for trapping you." "Maybe at first," he admitted. "I was young and selfish and focused on all the wrong things. But I would have figured it out eventually. I would have realized that you were the best thing that ever happened to me." They stood on the sidewalk in front of her childhood home, two people trying to bridge a gap created by years of silence and misunderstanding. "I want to try," Celine said finally. "I want to know you, to understand who you are now instead of who I imagined you to be. But I need you to understand something." "What?" "She's my mother, and I won't let you hurt her again. Whatever happens between us, whatever relationship we build, you don't get to break her heart twice." The fierceness in her voice, the protective love for her mother, reminded him so much of himself that it took his breath away. "I don't want to hurt her. I never wanted to hurt her." "Then prove it. Prove that you're the man she deserved 23 years ago, even if you weren't ready to be him then." As Celine walked up the front steps and disappeared into the house, Cashin realized that earning his daughter's trust was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done. But also the most important. Because sometimes, the most valuable things in life are the ones you have to fight to keep. The church bells were supposed to be ringing for a wedding, but instead they tolled like a funeral dirge as the three Rowan women sat in their living room, surrounded by returned gifts and cancelled flowers. The dress Maribel had spent weeks altering hung in its garment bag like a ghost of dreams that would never come true. "We should return the gifts," Eve-Laura said quietly, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of composure that came from a lifetime of facing disappointments with grace. "It's not right to keep them when there won't be a wedding." "Already done," Celine replied, checking items off a list. "The caterer says we forfeit the deposit, but the flowers can be donated to the children's hospital." The photographer was understanding. "She'll apply our payment to someone else's wedding." Maribel watched her daughter handle the aftermath with the same efficiency she'd inherited from her father, and felt her heart break a little more. Celine shouldn't have to clean up the mess left by 2 generations of Rowan women and their complicated relationships with Cashin Drexler. "I'm sorry," Maribel said for the 100th time in 3 weeks. "Mama, I'm so sorry. You deserved your happy ending, and I ruined it." "You didn't ruin anything, baby girl." Eve-Laura reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I fell in love with a ghost, with the memory of a young man who existed 30 years ago. The real Cashin Drexler belongs to you and Celine, not to me." "But you love him." "I loved the idea of him. The companionship, the kindness, the way he made me feel young again." Eve-Laura's smile was tinged with sadness. "But I never loved him the way you did. The way you still do." "I don't," Maribel started, but her mother cut her off with a look. "Don't lie to yourself, sweetheart. I've watched you for 23 years, seen how you never let another man get close, never even tried to build a relationship with someone else. You've been waiting for him to come back, even when you convinced yourself you hated him." The truth hit Maribel like a slap. All these years, all these dates she'd declined, all these good men she'd kept at arm's length because none of them were Cashin. She'd built a prison out of her first love and spent over 2 decades refusing to acknowledge the bars. "What if he doesn't want me?" she whispered. "What if he's only interested in Celine now?" "Then you'll survive," Eve-Laura said firmly. "The same way you survived raising a baby alone, working 3 jobs to keep a roof over your head, building a life out of nothing but determination and love. You're stronger than you think, Maribel. You always have been." The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Celine jumped up to answer it, and Maribel heard her daughter's voice mixing with a deeper one that made her heart skip a beat. "Mom," Celine called. "You have a visitor." Cashin appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain and younger than he had in years. He'd traded his expensive suits for jeans and a simple button-down shirt, and his hair was mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. "I brought lunch," he said, holding up a bag from Mike's diner. "Thought maybe we could talk." Eve-Laura rose gracefully from her chair, kissing Maribel's cheek as she passed. "I think I'll go help Mrs. Henderson with her garden. Celine, want to come with me?" "Actually, I have plans," Celine said, grabbing her purse. "That architecture internship won't apply for itself." And suddenly Maribel was alone with a man who'd shaped every important decision of her adult life, separated by 23 years of silence and a coffee table covered with wedding planning debris. "You didn't have to bring food," she said, because she had to say something, and small talk seemed safer than the conversation they really needed to have. "I remembered you used to love their grilled cheese," he said, sitting carefully on the edge of the couch. "And their chocolate pie. Thought maybe some things hadn't changed." "Some things haven't." She accepted the bag, inhaling the familiar smell of comfort food and memories. "But a lot of things have." "I know. I've missed so much, Maribel. So much of your life, of Celine's life, of everything that mattered." "You made your choice. I made the wrong choice." The words came out raw and honest. "The worst choice of my life. I chose ambition over love, success over family, everything that didn't matter over the only thing that did." Maribel unwrapped her sandwich with shaking hands. "You got everything you wanted, though. The empire, the recognition, the billions of dollars. And it means nothing without someone to share it with. Without you to share it with." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Maribel took a bite of grilled cheese and tasted her teenage years, when the diner had been their favorite place to dream about the future. "I followed your career," she admitted. "Saw the magazine covers, the newspaper articles about your success. There were pictures of you with different women at charity events and business dinners. There were beautiful women, successful women, women who understood my world." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I never loved any of them. I never even came close. Because they weren't me." "Because they weren't you," he confirmed. "Because every time I looked at them, I remembered what real love felt like, and nothing else measured up." Maribel set down her sandwich, her appetite gone. "Do you know what it was like, watching you build this amazing life while I was working 3 jobs just to keep Celine fed and clothed? Do you know what it was like seeing you with all those other women, and wondering if any of them would have been good enough to be her stepmother?" "I'm sorry. I'm not finished." Her voice was stronger now, fueled by 23 years of stored anger and hurt. "Do you know what it was like when Celine started asking about her father? When she wanted to know why he didn't love her enough to stay? What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes love isn't enough. That sometimes people make choices based on fear and pride instead of their hearts. That sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest." Cashin flinched like she'd hit him. "And you were talking about me." "I was talking about both of us. Because I hurt you too, didn't I? By not telling you about the pregnancy, by disappearing instead of fighting for what we had, by choosing pride over trust." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of all their mistakes settling between them like dust. "Where do we go from here?" Cashin asked finally. "I don't know," Maribel admitted. "We're not the same people we were 23 years ago. We've both changed, both been shaped by choices the other person never knew about. We're strangers now. Then let's get to know each other again. Let's figure out who we are now, who we could be together. And if we don't like what we find, then at least we'll know we tried. At least Celine will see that her parents were brave enough to fight for something real." Maribel looked around the living room where she'd raised their daughter, where she'd built a life out of love and stubbornness and determination. It was a good life, a life she was proud of. But it was also a life built around an absence, shaped by the ghost of a love she'd never quite let go. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's try." But as Cashin's face lit up with hope, Maribel wondered if some broken things could ever truly be made whole again, or if the cracks would always show, reminders of everything they'd lost along the way. The courthouse steps were slick with autumn rain as Cashin paced back and forth, checking his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. He'd asked Maribel to meet him here, on neutral ground, away from the house where they'd been carefully rebuilding their relationship for the past month. Today felt different. Today felt like a turning point. When he saw her walking up the sidewalk, his breath caught in his throat the same way it had 24 years ago when she'd first smiled at him across the diner. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes and carried an umbrella that she'd forgotten to use, her hair damp with rain and her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Sorry I'm late," she said, slightly breathless. "Last-minute crisis at the shop. Mrs. Chen's daughter decided she wanted to change her wedding dress 3 days before the ceremony." "You came," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. After all the careful conversations, all the tentative steps toward forgiveness, part of him had still been afraid she'd change her mind. "You asked me to." She studied his face, trying to read the expression there. "Cashin, what is this about? Why the courthouse?" "Because 24 years ago, I asked you to marry me in a moment of panic, when I was scared and desperate and trying to hold on to something I was too proud to fight for properly." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This time, I want to do it right." Maribel stared at the box like it was a live snake. "Cashin, no. We're still figuring things out." "I've been figuring it out for 24 years, he said, not opening the box yet, just holding it between them like a promise. "Every woman I dated, every relationship that didn't work, every night I went to bed alone, I was figuring out that nothing would ever compare to what we had. What we had was 24 years ago. We were kids. And what we have now." The question hung in the rain-soaked air between them. What did they have now? A month of careful dinners, long walks where they rediscovered each other's thoughts and dreams, quiet conversations on her front porch while Celine did homework inside. It wasn't the desperate passion of their youth, but it was something deeper. Something built on truth instead of fantasy. "I don't know what we have now," Maribel admitted. "I know that I still love you. I know that I never stopped loving you, even when I hated you for leaving. But love wasn't enough before, Cashin. What makes you think it's enough now? Because we're not the same people we were then. I'm not running away from commitment anymore, and you're not afraid to speak up for what you need. We've both learned what it costs to choose pride over love." He dropped to one knee on the wet courthouse steps, ignoring the curious stares of people walking by. "Maribel Rowan, I wasted 24 years being too stubborn and scared to fight for you properly. I won't waste another day." She was crying now, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "Get up, Cashin. People are staring. Let them stare. Let the whole world know that I'm madly in love with the mother of my daughter, that I've been carrying this ring around for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment to ask her to marry me." 2 weeks? You bought a ring 2 weeks ago. "I bought this ring 24 years ago," he admitted, his voice breaking. "The day after you refused to come with me. I was going to come back for you, was going to propose properly, and ask you to marry me here in your hometown instead of dragging you away from everything you loved. But you never came back. By the time I got the courage, you'd disappeared. I hired investigators, I searched everywhere, but Maribel Drexler was gone and I didn't know to look for Maribel Rowan." He opened the box, revealing a simple solitaire diamond that caught what little light filtered through the gray clouds. I've carried this with me for 24 years. Through every business meeting, every date with someone else, every night when I wondered what my life would have been like if I'd been brave enough to come home. Maribel stared at the ring, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. You kept it all this time? I kept it because some part of me always knew I'd find you again. Some part of me never stopped believing that real love doesn't just disappear, it waits. Cashin. I know I don't deserve you. I know I hurt you and abandoned you and missed 23 years of our daughter's life. I know I have no right to ask you to trust me again. He looked up at her with eyes that held all the love and regret and hope of nearly a quarter century. But I'm asking anyway. Marry me, Maribel. Not because it's practical or convenient, or because it would be good for Celine. Marry me because you love me, and I love you, and we're tired of wasting time on pride and fear. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through their clothes, but neither of them moved. Maribel looked down at this man who had shaped her entire adult life, who had given her the greatest gift she'd ever received in their daughter, who had broken her heart so completely she'd never quite learned how to put it back together. What if we mess this up again? She whispered. What if we hurt each other, hurt Celine? Then we'll figure it out together. No running away this time, no silent treatment, no pride getting in the way of honest conversation. We'll fight and make up and fight again, because that's what people who love each other do. The ring might not fit anymore. Then we'll get it resized. I'm not the same person I was at 22. I'm counting on that. I fell in love with who you were then, but I'm in love with who you are now. The woman who raised our daughter with such grace and strength, who built a life out of determination and love, who was brave enough to give me a second chance I definitely don't deserve. Maribel looked around at the courthouse steps, at the place where their daughter had been born in the county hospital just down the street, at the town where she'd built a life that was small but good and true. Ask me again, she said quietly. Will you marry me, Maribel Rowan? She held out her left hand, fingers trembling. Yes. The ring slid onto her finger like it had been waiting 24 years to come home, a perfect fit despite all the years and changes between then and now. And as Cashin stood up and pulled her into his arms, kissing her in the rain like they were 22 again, Maribel realized that sometimes love isn't about timing or circumstances or being the same people you were when you first fell. Sometimes love is about finding your way back to each other, no matter how long the journey takes. But their biggest test was still waiting for them at home, in the form of a daughter who was about to discover that her parents had just decided to become a family again. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and Cashin knew immediately that Celine had seen the engagement announcement in the local paper. He'd hoped to tell her in person, had planned a careful conversation over dinner, but apparently the Cedar Falls Gazette had beaten him to it. Celine. Maribel called from the kitchen, but their daughter was already storming into the living room, her face flushed with anger and betrayal. Are you kidding me right now? Celine threw the newspaper onto the coffee table, where the headline, "Local Businessman Proposes to Former Love," stared up at them like an accusation. You're engaged? You're actually engaged, and I had to find out from the newspaper. Sweetheart, we wanted to tell you. When? After the wedding? After you'd already made all the decisions about our family without including me in any of them. Cashin stood up from the couch, his heart sinking as he saw the hurt in his daughter's eyes. We wanted to talk to you today, wanted to explain. Explain what? That you're so desperate to play happy family that you're willing to ignore the fact that you barely know each other anymore. Celine's voice was rising, and he could hear 23 years of anger and abandonment in every word. Or maybe explain that you think a wedding ring is going to magically fix 24 years of damage? That's not fair, Maribel said quietly. We love each other, Celine. We always have. Love. Celine laughed bitterly. You want to talk about love? Let me tell you what love looks like. Love looks like my mom working 3 jobs to pay for my school clothes. Love looks like my grandma Eve Laura giving up her own dreams to help raise me. Love looks like sacrifice and showing up and being there even when it's hard. She turned to Cashin, her eyes blazing with hurt. You know what love doesn't look like? It doesn't look like abandoning your pregnant girlfriend because your career is more important. It doesn't look like spending 23 years building an empire while your daughter grows up wondering why she wasn't worth coming back for. The words hit him like physical blows, each one landing with the precision of someone who'd spent her entire life crafting arguments for a father who'd never been there to hear them. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. I failed you both, and I can't undo that failure no matter how much I want to. Then why are you trying to pretend we can just be a normal family? Why are you asking her to marry you when you don't even know who I am, what I like, what I'm afraid of, what makes me laugh? Because I want to learn, he said simply. Because I want to know everything about you, and I want you to know me. Not the man I was 23 years ago, but the man I am now. And you think marriage is going to accomplish that? I think commitment is going to accomplish that. I think promising to show up every day, to be present for all of it, the good and the bad and the boring ordinary moments, is going to accomplish that. Celine was crying now, angry tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. You don't get to just decide we're a family now. You don't get to walk in here with flowers and promises and expect us to forget 23 years of your absence. I don't want you to forget, Cashin said, stepping closer. I want you to remember every birthday I missed, every school play I wasn't there for, every time you needed a father and I wasn't there. Because I want you to see that I'm not going anywhere this time. How can you promise that? How can you promise anything when you've already proven you'll leave when things get difficult? The question hung in the air like a challenge. How do you prove you've changed to someone who has every reason not to believe you? How do you rebuild trust that was broken before?